On March 14, 1993, 26-year-old veterinary assistant Jennifer Hartley vanished from the parking lot of Cascade Animal Hospital in the small logging town of Ridgeline, Oregon, population 8,000. Her car remained locked, keys inside, engine still warm. 29 years later, in the spring of 2022, DNA genealogy technology identified the person responsible through genetic material preserved from evidence collected at the scene. The breakthrough came from a sample so small that investigators in 1993 had deemed it insufficient for testing with the technology available at that time. What made the case truly devastating was not just the length of time that passed, but who the evidence pointed to. Someone the entire town had trusted. Someone who had searched for Jennifer longer and harder than anyone else. If you're interested in more cold cases like this, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The morning started like any other spring day in Ridgeline. Mist clung to the Douglas firs that surrounded the town, and the air smelled of wet earth and sawdust from the lumber mill on the north end. Detective Rachel Morrison stood in the doorway of the Oregon State Police Forensic Lab, holding a file folder that weighed almost nothing but felt impossibly heavy. Inside that folder was a single sheet of paper, a DNA match. After 29 years of waiting, of wondering, of hoping, the genetic material from a cigarette butt found 40 feet from Jennifer Hartley's abandoned car had finally been connected to a person. Rachel had been a rookie patrol officer in 1993, fresh out of the academy. She remembered the day Jennifer disappeared, remembered the search parties, remembered the volunteers who walked the forest trails for weeks, calling Jennifer's name until their voices went hoarse. She remembered one volunteer in particular. Now, in 2022, Rachel was the lead detective on cold cases for Ridgeline PD. She had reopened Jennifer's file 3 years ago when the department received grant funding for DNA genealogy testing. The cigarette butt had been sitting in an evidence box for nearly 3 decades, carefully preserved by an evidence technician who had believed, even back then, that someday technology would catch up, that someday had arrived. Rachel looked down at the name on the paper. Her hands began to shake. She had to sit down. She had to call the district attorney. She had to prepare a warrant. But first, she had to process what she was seeing. Because the name on that paper belonged to someone who had been questioned extensively in 1993. Someone who had been cleared. Someone who had organized the largest search party Ridgeline had ever seen. David Brennan, the man who had printed Jennifer's missing posters. The man who had coordinated volunteers for 6 straight weeks. The man who had stood beside Jennifer's parents at every press conference, his arm around Jennifer's mother, tears streaming down his face. Rachel closed the file folder and walked to her car. She had arrest warrants to prepare. In March of 1993, Jennifer Hartley was building the kind of life that people in small towns admired. She worked at Cascade Animal Hospital, where she was known for her gentle touch with frightened animals and her ability to calm anxious pet owners. On her days off, she haunted estate sales and antique shops, searching for damaged furniture that she could restore in the garage behind her rental house. Her apartment was filled with her projects. A Victorian writing desk she had stripped of 7 layers of paint. A rocking chair with new caning she had woven herself. A dining table she had rescued from someone's curb, its surface now smooth as glass after weeks of sanding and refinishing. Friends joked that Jennifer could see potential in anything broken. She had grown up in Ridgeline, graduated from Ridgeline High in 1984, then spent 2 years at a veterinary technician program in Portland before returning home. Her parents, Tom and Linda Hartley, owned a hardware store on Main Street. Jennifer's brother, Michael, worked as a foreman at the lumber mill. It was the kind of family that had roots in Ridgeline going back 4 generations. The Hartleys were fixtures in town. Tom had inherited the hardware store from his father in 1970. Linda had taught kindergarten for 30 years before retiring in 1990. They lived in the same house where Tom had grown up, a craftsman-style home on Oak Street, with a wraparound porch and a garden that Linda tended obsessively. Jennifer and Michael had played in that garden as children, building forts under the rhododendrons, catching salamanders by the creek that ran along the back property line. Michael was 4 years older than Jennifer. He had been protective of her growing up, the way older brothers in small towns often were. When Jennifer was in high school and a boy broke her heart, Michael had a quiet conversation with that boy in the parking lot. The boy never bothered Jennifer again. When Jennifer moved back from Portland, Michael had helped her move into the cottage on Hemlock Street, carrying boxes of books and furniture refinishing tools. They had dinner together every Friday night at their parents' house. This was ritual. Linda would cook pot roast or chicken, something that filled the house with warmth. They would sit around the table that had been in the family for generations, talking about their weeks, laughing at Michael's stories from the mill, listening to Tom's complaints about suppliers. Jennifer would bring dessert, usually something she'd baked herself: lemon bars, apple pie, chocolate chip cookies that were Michael's favorite. The Friday before she disappeared, March 12, 1993, Jennifer had brought strawberry rhubarb pie. She had seemed happy that night, Linda would later tell police. She'd talked about a desk she'd found at an estate sale, how it had beautiful bones under the chipped paint. She'd talked about a litter of puppies that had come into the clinic that week, how one of them had fallen asleep in her arms. Normal conversation. Nothing troubling. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. Michael remembered that Jennifer had mentioned she was thinking about taking a class in furniture upholstery. There was a woman in Salem who taught workshops on weekends. Jennifer thought it would expand her skills. She was always trying to learn new techniques. Michael had teased her about turning their parents' garage into a furniture workshop. Jennifer had laughed and said she was seriously considering it. That was the last normal conversation the family had together. Jennifer lived alone in a small cottage on Hemlock Street, 3 blocks from the animal hospital. She drove a 1987 Honda Accord, light blue, with a bumper sticker that read, "Who rescued who?" On weekends, she volunteered at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in the state park, caring for injured owls and hawks. She had friends, though not a large circle. She was quiet, more comfortable with animals than crowds. But the people who knew her well spoke of her kindness, her patience, her habit of leaving books at your door if she thought you'd like them. She dated occasionally, but never seriously. She told her best friend, Sarah Chen, that she was content. She had her work, her projects, her parents just 5 minutes away. March 14th, 1993, was a Sunday. Jennifer worked the early shift at the animal hospital, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. The clinic was only open half days on weekends, covering emergencies and basic care. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the clinic's owner, remembered Jennifer arriving right on time, carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag with what looked like a muffin inside. The morning was quiet. A cat with an abscess, a dog who had eaten something it shouldn't have, a family bringing in their rabbit for a checkup. Jennifer moved through the tasks with her usual calm efficiency. She wore scrubs with little paw prints on them. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She hummed while she worked, Dr. Reeves recalled. Something soft, maybe Beatles or Simon and Garfunkel. The cat belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a widow who lived on Maple Street. Jennifer had cared for this cat, a tabby named Winston, for 3 years. She knew exactly how to hold Winston so he wouldn't panic, knew to scratch behind his left ear to calm him, while Dr. Reeves administered the antibiotic injection. Mrs. Vance always requested Jennifer specifically. "She has the touch," Mrs. Vance told anyone who would listen. "Animals trust her." The dog was a golden retriever named Buddy, belonging to the Morrison family. Their son, 8-year-old Tyler, had given Buddy part of his Halloween candy back in October: chocolate. The parents had panicked and rushed Buddy to the emergency line. Jennifer had stayed 2 hours past her shift that night, monitoring Buddy, reassuring Tyler that his dog would be okay. Now, 5 months later, Buddy's tail wagged the moment Jennifer walked into the exam room. Tyler had brought her a thank you drawing that day, a crayon picture of Jennifer with a superhero cape. She had tacked it to the bulletin board in the break room. The rabbit was new to the clinic. A family had just adopted it from a farm outside town. They wanted to make sure it was healthy. Jennifer weighed the rabbit, checked its teeth, listened to its heart. She explained to the children how to hold it properly, how to create a safe space in their home. She spoke softly, patiently, making eye contact with the kids, not just their parents. This was her gift, making both the animals and their people feel safe. Between appointments, Jennifer restocked the supply cabinets. She noticed they were low on gauze and made a note for Dr. Reeves's Monday order. She cleaned the exam tables with the precision she brought to everything. The clinic was small, just 2 exam rooms, a surgery suite, and a small kennel area for overnight stays. But Jennifer treated it like it was the Mayo Clinic. Everything in its place, everything clean, everything ready for whatever emergency might come through the door. Dr. Reeves remembered looking at the clock around 1 p.m. Jennifer was in the break room, eating her lunch, the muffin she'd brought from home and an apple. She was reading her library book, The Secret History, her finger marking her place on the page. Dr. Reeves remembered thinking that Jennifer looked content, not happy in a loud, obvious way, just quietly satisfied with her life, the kind of contentment that comes from doing work you find meaningful. They talked briefly about the upcoming week. Dr. Reeves mentioned she'd be doing a spay surgery on Tuesday and would need Jennifer's assistance. Jennifer made a note in her planner, a small, spiral-bound notebook she kept in her scrub pocket. The planner was later found in her car, that Tuesday's date circled, "Spay surgery, 10 a.m., written in her neat handwriting. She had been planning for a future that would never arrive. At 2:30, Jennifer began closing procedures. She cleaned the exam rooms, restocked supplies, and filled out the day's paperwork. Dr. Reeves left at 2:45, trusting Jennifer to lock up. This was routine. Jennifer closed alone every Sunday. At 3:15, Jennifer walked to her Honda in the small parking lot behind the clinic. The lot held 6 spaces, bordered by a chain-link fence on one side and a dense wall of forest on the other. Security cameras were not common in 1993, especially not in small-town parking lots. There were no cameras. Jennifer's car was parked in its usual spot, 3rd from the left. She kept her keys in her right jacket pocket. She carried a canvas tote bag with her lunch container and a library book inside. The book was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, checked out 3 days earlier. She was on page 147. What happened next was reconstructed from evidence, not witnesses. No one saw Jennifer in those final moments. Her car was found later that evening at 6:30 by Dr. Reeves, who had returned to the clinic after realizing she'd forgotten her phone. Jennifer's Honda sat exactly where it should be, locked, keys visible on the driver's seat, the canvas tote bag on the passenger side, the engine cold, but the steering wheel and hood still held faint warmth, suggesting the car had been running not long before. The driver's side door was locked. So were all the other doors. The windows were rolled up except for the driver's side window, which was cracked open about 2 inches, the way Jennifer always kept it to prevent the car from getting stuffy. Inside, everything looked normal. The keys sat in the center of the driver's seat, not tossed casually, but placed deliberately. The canvas tote bag was upright on the passenger seat, not knocked over. The library book visible inside. Her sunglasses in the cup holder. A cassette tape of Fleetwood Mac's Rumors in the tape deck. Dr. Reeves noticed something else. Jennifer's jacket. She had been wearing a light green windbreaker that morning when she arrived at work. That jacket now lay folded on the back seat. Not crumpled. Folded. As if Jennifer had carefully removed it and placed it there. But Jennifer was nowhere to be seen. Dr. Reeves called her name, walking around the parking lot. The lot was small, surrounded by chain-link fence on the back side and dense forest on the others. Behind the fence was a drainage ditch, then old-growth forest that stretched for miles into the Cascade foothills. No buildings were visible from the parking lot. The nearest business was a gas station half a mile down the road. Dr. Reeves checked the clinic door. Locked, as it should be. She used her key to go inside, calling Jennifer's name. The lights were off. The clinic was empty. Everything was clean and organized, exactly as Jennifer always left it. Nothing disturbed. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. Just an empty building that Jennifer had locked up properly before walking to her car. Dr. Reeves returned to the parking lot, her concern growing into fear. She noticed the forest beyond the fence. Dark. Silent. The Douglas firs towered overhead, their branches thick with spring growth. You could walk 20 feet into those trees and disappear from view completely. The undergrowth was dense with ferns and salal. The ground was soft from rain, covered in pine needles and moss. She noticed something at the edge of the parking lot, near where the asphalt met the gravel shoulder. Scuff marks. Fresh. As if someone had been dragged or had dragged their feet, leading toward the fence line. Dr. Reeves's heart was pounding now. She ran back to her car and grabbed her phone. Dr. Reeves called 911 at 6:38 p.m. Police arrived within minutes. Officer Rachel Morrison was first on scene, along with Sergeant Bill Crawford, a 20-year veteran who had taught Jennifer in Sunday school when she was a child. They searched the parking lot, the clinic, the surrounding forest. They called Jennifer's name. They checked the building, though Dr. Reeves confirmed she had locked it hours earlier. They found nothing disturbed. No signs of struggle in the parking lot. No blood. No torn fabric. Just Jennifer's car, sitting there as if she'd stepped away for a moment and would return any second. But she didn't return. By 8 p.m., Jennifer's parents had been notified. By 9 p.m., a dozen volunteers were searching the woods with flashlights. By midnight, the state police had been called in. By dawn, Ridgeline understood that something terrible had happened. The investigation moved quickly in those first 72 hours, the critical window. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Jennifer, her parents, her brother, her co-workers at the clinic, her friends from high school, the volunteers at the wildlife center, the regular customers whose pets she treated. Everyone described the same person. Quiet, kind, reliable, not the type to just disappear, not someone who would worry her family. Jennifer called her mother every Sunday evening at 6 p.m. It was their ritual. That Sunday, the phone had rung and rung in the empty cottage on Hemlock Street. Detectives searched Jennifer's home. They found everything in order. Her bed was made. Dishes were washed. Bills were paid and stacked neatly on her desk. There was no journal, no diary with secrets. Her furniture projects sat in various stages of completion in the garage. A half-refinished dresser, a chair with one leg still needing repair. Projects she had been planning to finish. The forensic team processed Jennifer's car. They found her fingerprints naturally. They found Dr. Reeves's fingerprints on the driver's door handle from when she'd looked inside. They found hair samples, but those matched Jennifer. They found nothing that suggested anyone else had been in that car recently. But in the parking lot, 40 feet from Jennifer's Honda, a deputy named Marcus Shaw found something. A cigarette butt, partially hidden under a dried leaf near the fence line. It was a Marlboro Red. The filter had faint moisture, suggesting it had been smoked recently, maybe that afternoon. The cigarette butt was collected, logged as evidence, and sent to the state crime lab. In 1993, DNA testing was possible, but expensive and time-consuming. The sample size from a cigarette butt was small. The lab examined it, but concluded that with the technology available, there wasn't enough material to generate a reliable profile. The cigarette butt was photographed, documented, and stored in the evidence room. Days became weeks. Volunteers searched an ever-widening radius around Ridgeline. They walked logging roads, checked abandoned buildings, waded through creeks. The forest around Ridgeline was vast, thousands of acres of Douglas fir and hemlock, crisscrossed with old trails and forgotten access roads from decades of logging. One volunteer stood out among all the others: David Brennan. David was 38 years old in 1993. He owned Brennan's print shop on Main Street, 3 doors down from the Hartley family hardware store. He had lived in Ridgeline his entire life, graduating from Ridgeline High in 1973. He had never married. He lived alone in a small house on Birch Avenue. People knew him as quiet but helpful, the type of man who would stay late to finish a rush print job, who never complained about small-town life. He was unremarkable in the way that many small-town business owners are. Average height, average build, thinning brown hair that he combed carefully over a bald spot. He wore glasses with wire frames. He dressed conservatively, button-down shirts tucked into khakis, sometimes a cardigan sweater. He had a soft voice and a habit of making eye contact just a little too long when he spoke to you, something people interpreted as sincerity. His print shop smelled of ink and paper. The walls were lined with samples of his work: wedding invitations, business cards, flyers for school events. He had printed the programs for every high school graduation since 1980. He had printed menus for the 3 restaurants in town. He had printed the Christmas concert programs for the Methodist Church. He was woven into the fabric of Ridgeline in the invisible way that service providers often are. People liked David, or at least they didn't dislike him. He wasn't someone you'd invite to a party, but he was someone you'd wave to on the street. He sat alone at the counter of the diner most mornings, reading the Oregonian and drinking black coffee. He attended city council meetings occasionally, never speaking, but always taking notes. He volunteered to print materials for local fundraisers at cost, or sometimes for free. When Jennifer disappeared, David stepped up in a way that impressed everyone. On March 16th, just 2 days after Jennifer vanished, David appeared at the police station with 2,000 missing person flyers. He had designed them himself, using the best photo of Jennifer that her parents had provided. The photo showed Jennifer smiling, holding a puppy at the animal clinic, her face lit with genuine joy. The flyers were professionally done, David's best work, full color on quality paper stock. Jennifer's family has been good to me for years, David told Sergeant Crawford. This is the least I can do. What David didn't mention was that he had started designing the flyers on March 14th, before Jennifer was officially reported missing, before the police had confirmed it was a potential crime. as if he had known, somehow, that flyers would be needed. When Sergeant Crawford later reviewed the timeline, this detail bothered him. But in the chaos of the first few days, no one had thought to question it. David organized search parties with military precision. He created sign-up sheets at his print shop, divided volunteers into teams, assigned each team a specific area of forest or town to cover. He made maps, professional quality maps with grids and coordinates, marking which areas had been searched and which needed coverage. He coordinated with the police, with state park rangers, with local logging companies to get access to private roads. He was at the police station every morning at 7 a.m. He brought coffee, always asking what he could do to help. He volunteered to man the tip line, writing down every call in neat handwriting. He organized the community bulletin board, posting updates, coordinating volunteers. He was everywhere, helpful, concerned, tireless. He printed more flyers as the first batch ran out, then posters, then banners. Help find Jennifer Hartley, in bold red letters hung across Main Street, flapping in the wind. He organized fundraisers to support the search efforts. A bake sale, a raffle, a concert at the high school gymnasium. He stood beside Tom and Linda Hartley at press conferences, his arm around Linda when she broke down in tears, his face a mask of concern and grief. People in Ridgeline spoke of David with admiration. If only everyone cared as much as David Brennan, the mayor said at one of the press conferences. The local newspaper ran a profile of him, calling him Ridgeline's most dedicated volunteer. David kept the newspaper clipping, framing it and hanging it in his print shop. When volunteers met each morning, David was there with coffee he'd paid for himself, bakery donuts in white boxes. He kept morale up when spirits flagged. When someone found a piece of torn fabric in the woods that might have been Jennifer's, David was there to carefully bag it with latex gloves he'd bought at the pharmacy, bringing it to the police as if it were sacred evidence. Looking back, there were small things that might have been red flags. The way David always knew where the police were searching before the information was publicly released. The way he steered volunteers away from certain areas, claiming they'd already been thoroughly covered when they hadn't been. The way he volunteered to search alone sometimes, disappearing into the forest for hours and returning empty-handed, but somehow satisfied. There was the time he brought in a cigarette butt he'd found near the creek, saying it might be evidence. The lab tested it. It wasn't Jennifer's. DNA testing was expensive, and the police couldn't justify testing every cigarette butt that might be litter. They thanked David for being vigilant. There was the way he sometimes seemed to know details about Jennifer that he shouldn't have known. Her routine at the animal clinic. The fact that she closed alone on Sundays. When Sergeant Crawford mentioned this in his notes, he wrote, "Brennan seems well informed, but attributes it to conversations with Tom Hartley at hardware store. Plausible. There was the intensity of his involvement. Most volunteers helped for a few days or a week, then had to return to their normal lives. David never seemed to tire. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months. He was still organizing searches when everyone else had given up. When other volunteers commented on his dedication, David would shake his head sadly and say, "I just can't stop. Not until we find her." It was interpreted as compassion. It might have been something else entirely. Detectives interviewed David, as they interviewed everyone. He sat in the interview room, cooperative and calm. He explained that he knew Jennifer only casually. She came into his print shop occasionally when her father needed custom signs for the hardware store. He had printed programs for the wildlife center where she volunteered. He might have seen her at the diner on Main Street, where everyone in town ate breakfast or lunch at some point. Had he seen her the day she disappeared? No. He had been at home that Sunday, doing yard work, working in his garden. No one could confirm this, as he lived alone, but there was no evidence suggesting he was anywhere near the animal hospital that afternoon. Did he know of anyone who might want to hurt Jennifer? No. Everyone loved Jennifer. It made no sense. He shook his head, his face creased with worry. The detectives thanked him for his time and for his efforts organizing the search. They had no reason to suspect David Brennan. He was a pillar of the community's response to tragedy. Weeks turned into months. The searches continued, but with decreasing frequency. By June, the volunteer efforts had dwindled. People had to return to their lives, their jobs. The forest had yielded nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of Jennifer Hartley anywhere. The case grew cold. In 1994, Jennifer's parents held a memorial service, though there was no body to bury. Half the town attended. David Brennan sat in the front row, weeping openly. He had made the memorial programs, donating his printing services. The cover featured the same photo he had used on the missing person flyers. Jennifer smiling, her blonde hair catching sunlight, her eyes bright with life. Years passed. Tom and Linda Hartley aged visibly, the weight of not knowing crushing them slowly. Michael married, had children, but the shadow of his missing sister hung over every family gathering. Dr. Reeves kept Jennifer's name tag in her desk drawer at the animal clinic. Sarah Chen moved to Seattle, but never forgot her best friend. And David Brennan continued to live quietly in Ridgeline, running his print shop, tending his garden, a man who had done everything he could to help find Jennifer Hartley and had never stopped caring. In 2019, Detective Rachel Morrison was promoted to lead investigator for cold cases. She was 50 years old now, 26 years removed from that March night when she'd been first on scene at Cascade Animal Hospital's parking lot. The case had never left her mind. She pulled Jennifer's file from archives, thick with reports, witness statements, search logs, photos. She read through everything again, as she had done many times over the years. She looked at the evidence list, and there, listed near the bottom, was the cigarette butt. Marlboro Red, found 40 feet from victim's vehicle. DNA sample insufficient for testing per 1993 technology. Rachel picked up her phone and called the Oregon State Police Forensic Lab. She asked about genetic genealogy, the new technique that was solving cold cases across the country. Could they retest old evidence? How small could the sample be? The answer was encouraging. With modern techniques, they could extract DNA from samples that would have been useless in 1993. But it wasn't cheap. Each sample cost thousands of dollars. The department would need grant funding. Rachel applied for every grant available. She wrote proposals. She made presentations to the city council. She explained that Jennifer Hartley deserved answers, that her parents, now in their 80s, deserved to know what happened to their daughter before they died. In 2020, Ridgeline PD received a $50,000 grant from a state fund dedicated to solving cold cases using new forensic technology. Rachel immediately submitted the cigarette butt for analysis. Then came the waiting. Extracting DNA from degraded samples took time. Building a genetic profile took time. Searching genealogy databases took time. Rachel called the lab every month. Patience, they told her. These things couldn't be rushed. In March 2022, 29 years to the month after Jennifer vanished, the lab called. They had a match. The cigarette butt's DNA had been run through genetic genealogy databases. The process was complex, searching for distant relatives who had submitted their DNA to ancestry websites. The lab had found several third and fourth cousins. Working backwards through family trees, a genetic genealogist had narrowed the possibilities down to a single family line, and then down to a single name: David Brennan. Rachel sat in her office, staring at the report. It made no sense. David had been cleared in 1993. He had been the most dedicated volunteer. He had searched harder than anyone. He had cared more than anyone except Jennifer's own family. But DNA didn't lie. Rachel read the report 3 times. The probability was overwhelming. The DNA from that cigarette butt belonged to David Brennan, or to an identical twin he'd never mentioned having. She thought about those searches in 1993, David organizing everything, David making maps, David always asking what areas needed coverage, David finding that piece of torn fabric in the woods, David bringing evidence to the police. What if it hadn't been dedication? What if it had been something else? What if David had been monitoring the investigation, inserting himself into the search to make sure nothing was found? What if he had been watching the police, seeing how close they might get? Rachel thought about psychological profiles she'd read. Killers who inserted themselves into investigations, who became volunteer searchers, who attended vigils and memorial services, who craved the attention, the drama, the sense of control, who got a thrill from being close to the investigation while hiding in plain sight. She remembered David at Jennifer's memorial service, weeping in the front row. Had those tears been real? Or had he been playing a role? Rachel needed more than DNA. She needed a motive. She needed to understand why. She started digging into David Brennan's background. He was 67 years old now, still living in Ridgeline, still running his print shop, quiet, unmarried, no criminal record. But when Rachel looked deeper, patterns emerged. David had lived in 3 other small towns before returning to Ridgeline in 1979. Oak Ridge, Oregon from 1973 to 1975. Grants Pass, Oregon from 1975 to 1977. Bend, Oregon from 1977 to 1979. Rachel requested police records from those towns. In Oak Ridge, in 1974, a 19-year-old woman named Michelle Porter had been reported missing. She worked at a grocery store, last seen leaving work. Her car had been found in the parking lot, locked, keys inside. No body had ever been found. The case went cold. In Grants Pass, in 1976, a 23-year-old woman named Teresa Lang had vanished after her shift at a restaurant. Her car was found in the parking lot, locked, keys inside. No body. Case unsolved. In Bend, in 1978, a 25-year-old woman named Kimberly Ross disappeared from a shopping center parking lot. Car found locked, keys inside, no body recovered. Case went cold. Rachel felt sick. 3 women, 3 cold cases, all in towns where David Brennan had lived, all with the same pattern, all with cars left behind, locked, keys inside, and Jennifer in 1993. The same pattern. Rachel contacted the police departments in those 3 towns. Could they check their evidence storage? Did they have any physical evidence from those cases? Anything with potential DNA? Oak Ridge had nothing. Their evidence from 1974 had been lost in a fire. Grants Pass had a box from the Teresa Lang case, but it contained only photographs and witness statements. Nothing biological. But Bend still had evidence from the Kimberly Ross disappearance, including a cigarette butt found near her car. Marlboro Red. Rachel held her breath. Could they test it? The Bend police agreed. The sample was sent to the Oregon State Police Lab. Rachel waited. 3 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA from the cigarette butt in Bend matched the DNA from the cigarette butt in Ridgeline. David Brennan had left his signature at 2 crime scenes, probably more. but 2 was enough. Rachel met with the district attorney. They had DNA evidence linking David Brennan to Jennifer Hartley's disappearance and to Kimberly Ross's disappearance. They had a pattern spanning 2 decades. They had probable cause. On April 12, 2022, Rachel Morrison led a team of officers to Brennan's print shop on Main Street. It was a Tuesday morning. The spring rain was falling softly. The bell above the shop door chimed as they entered. David Brennan stood behind the counter, wearing a cardigan and glasses, looking like someone's grandfather. He was helping a customer select paper stock for wedding invitations. He looked up as the officers entered, and for just a moment, Rachel saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, understanding, fear. Then he smiled, that same helpful smile he'd worn for 30 years. "Officers," he said pleasantly, "how can I help you?" Rachel stepped forward. "David Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Hartley." The customer gasped and backed away. David's smile faded. He stood very still, hands on the counter. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He simply looked at Rachel with empty eyes and said, "I'd like my attorney." David Brennan's house on Birch Avenue was searched the same day. What investigators found turned the case from theory to certainty. In David's basement, hidden behind a false wall he had constructed in 1993, police found a storage area. Inside were boxes, dozens of boxes, carefully organized, labeled with dates and names. Michelle, 1974. Teresa, 1976. Kimberly, 1978. Jennifer, 1993. Each box contained items, photographs, newspaper clippings about the disappearances, police reports that David must have acquired or copied, and personal items, a bracelet, a hairbrush, a watch, a keychain, trophies. Jennifer's box contained her library card, a small wooden bird she had carved at the Wildlife Center, a photograph of her that had never been released to the public, and a notebook, David's notebook, filled with his observations, entries about watching Jennifer, following her, learning her routine. The notebook revealed a mind that had been obsessed. David had watched Jennifer for months before March 14, 1993. He had tracked her schedule. He knew when she worked alone. He knew she closed the clinic by herself every Sunday. He knew exactly when to be in that parking lot. The notebook also contained reflections written after Jennifer's disappearance. David describing how he had organized the searches, how he had enjoyed being close to the investigation, how he had stood beside Jennifer's parents, comforting them, while knowing exactly what had happened to their daughter. "They trust me completely," he wrote. "I'm the hero of this story. No one suspects the man who tried harder than anyone to find her." In the backyard, cadaver dogs alerted to an area near the back fence. Investigators began excavating. 3 feet down, they found human remains, badly decomposed, but enough for identification through dental records. Jennifer Hartley, or at least the parts of Jennifer that David had kept. Further searches of David's property and previous properties revealed more remains. Michelle Porter, Teresa Lang, Kimberly Ross, all buried, all kept close by their killer. David Brennan was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The district attorney sought consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The trial began in November 2022 in the Clackamas County Courthouse. The case had drawn national attention. The volunteer who had searched harder than anyone, the helpful neighbor, the man who had hidden in plain sight for 30 years, playing the role of the concerned citizen while keeping his victims buried in his yard. The courtroom was packed every day. Local news crews, national media, true crime podcasters. Jennifer's family sat in the front row, Tom and Linda Hartley flanked by their son Michael and his family. Detective Rachel Morrison attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back, watching as the case she had built was presented to the jury. David Brennan sat at the defense table, wearing a navy suit that made him look like someone's grandfather. His attorney, Marcus Webb, was a public defender who had been assigned the case. Webb was experienced, competent, but he had an impossible job. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Karen Vasquez, a 20-year veteran known for her methodical approach. She built her case slowly, carefully, piece by piece. The first witness was Detective Morrison herself. Vasquez walked her through the reopening of the cold case in 2019, the application for grant funding, the decision to submit the cigarette butt for DNA genealogy testing. Morrison explained the process in simple terms for the jury. How genetic genealogy worked, how a cigarette butt from 1993 had yielded DNA that could be traced through family trees, how that DNA had led to David Brennan. Webb cross-examined gently, trying to establish reasonable doubt. Detective Morrison, you were a rookie officer in 1993, is that correct? Yes. And Mr. Brennan was one of many people questioned in the investigation? He was. And he was cleared at that time? He was, based on the evidence and technology available in 1993. So this entire case rests on a cigarette butt found 40 feet from the victim's car, correct? Morrison paused, then said calmly, No. This case rests on DNA evidence, physical evidence found at Mr. Brennan's property, and a pattern of behavior spanning 3 decades. The cigarette butt was the beginning, not the end. The second witness was Dr. Helena Torres, the genetic genealogist who had traced the DNA. She was in her 40s, wearing glasses and a professional demeanor that inspired confidence. She explained her work in detail, using charts and diagrams to show how she had built family trees from distant relatives, working backwards through generations until she isolated David Brennan's family line. How certain are you that the DNA from the cigarette butt belongs to the defendant? Vasquez asked. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than David Brennan or an identical twin is less than 1 in 10 billion. Does the defendant have an identical twin? No. He is an only child. Webb tried to challenge the science, suggesting that genetic genealogy was too new, too untested. Dr. Torres calmly explained that the technique had been used to solve dozens of cold cases, had been validated by multiple independent labs, and was accepted by courts across the country. The third day of testimony brought Dr. Patricia Reeves to the stand. She was 70 now, long retired from veterinary practice. She walked slowly to the witness box, her hand shaking slightly as she was sworn in. Vasquez asked her to describe March 14, 1993. Dr. Reeves's voice was steady as she described Jennifer's last day of work. The routine morning. How Jennifer had seemed perfectly normal, humming as she worked. How Dr. Reeves had left at 2:45, trusting Jennifer to lock up. Did you know the defendant in 1993? I knew who he was. His print shop was a few doors down from the Hartley family hardware store. He had printed some flyers for our clinic. Did Jennifer know him? Casually. She may have seen him around town. Ridgeline is small. Everyone knows everyone, at least by sight. Did Jennifer ever mention Mr. Brennan to you? No, never. Then Vasquez asked the critical question. Dr. Reeves, when you returned to the clinic that evening and found Jennifer's car but not Jennifer, you called 911. Did you see anyone else in the area? No. The parking lot was empty except for Jennifer's car. What about evidence of anyone else having been there? Dr. Reeves described the scuff marks near the fence line. They looked fresh, like someone had dragged their feet or been dragged. The courtroom was silent. Tom Hartley put his arm around his wife. The fourth day brought Linda Hartley to the stand. She was 82 years old now, her hair completely white, her face lined with decades of grief. Vasquez helped her to the witness box gently. The questions were simple. Tell us about Jennifer. What kind of person was she? Linda's voice was soft but clear. Jennifer was kind. That's what I remember most. Not just to people, but to everything. Animals, plants. She would rescue spiders from the house instead of killing them. She would bring home injured birds and nurse them until they could fly again. Tell us about March 14th, 1993. Linda described waiting for Jennifer's call that Sunday evening. 6 p.m., like always. How she had waited by the phone. 6:15, 6:30. How she had called Jennifer's cottage. No answer. How she had called the animal clinic. No answer. How she had called the police at 7. Tell us about David Brennan's involvement in the search. Linda's voice wavered. He was wonderful. At least, that's what I thought. He organized everything. He printed thousands of flyers. He stood beside us at every press conference. He hugged me at Jennifer's memorial service. He told me he wished he could have done more. How did that make you feel? At the time? Grateful. I thought he was the most caring person in Ridgeline. Linda paused, tears running down her face. Now? Knowing that he knew where Jennifer was the whole time? Knowing that he was pretending to care while... She couldn't finish. Webb declined to cross-examine. There was nothing to gain from questioning a grieving mother. The fifth day brought the forensic evidence. Crime scene technicians described processing David's property in April 2022, finding the false wall in the basement, the boxes behind it, the careful documentation of every item. Photographs were shown to the jury. Jennifer's library card, the wooden bird she had carved, the notebook with David's observations, page after page of David's handwriting, describing Jennifer's routine, her schedule when she worked alone. One entry was particularly chilling. Sunday afternoons she locks the clinic alone, parking lot hidden from street, dense forest access, perfect timing. Another entry, written days after Jennifer disappeared. Search going well. Police haven't found anything. They won't. I've watched them. They're searching all the wrong places. I make sure of it. And another, from months later. Linda Hartley hugged me today, thanked me for never giving up on finding Jennifer. If only she knew. The irony is delicious. The courtroom was silent as these entries were read aloud. Several jurors looked sick. The sixth day brought testimony about the excavation of David's backyard. A forensic anthropologist described finding human remains 3 feet below the surface, near the back fence. The careful excavation process. The recovery of skeletal remains that dental records confirmed belonged to Jennifer Marie Hartley. Were there other remains found on the property? Yes. We found remains belonging to 3 other individuals, later identified as Michelle Porter, Teresa Lang, and Kimberly Ross. All in the defendant's backyard? Yes, all within a 20-foot radius, buried at similar depths. The prosecution rested on day 7. They had presented overwhelming evidence. DNA, physical evidence, witness testimony, the defendant's own words in his notebook. 4 victims buried in his yard. The defense's case was brief. Webb called character witnesses who testified that David had been a quiet, helpful man, that he had run a successful print shop, that he had volunteered for community causes. But these testimonies felt hollow against the weight of evidence. Webb tried to argue that the notebook entries could be interpreted differently, that David's observations of Jennifer might have been part of his efforts to help find her, not evidence of stalking. The jury looked skeptical. David Brennan never took the stand. Webb advised against it, knowing that the prosecution would destroy him in cross-examination. David's own words in his notebook would convict him. There was nothing he could say that would help his case. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found David Brennan guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. David was 67 years old. He would die in prison. As officers led him away, David looked back at the gallery. His eyes found Linda Hartley, sitting in the front row between her son and Detective Morrison. For a moment, he seemed about to speak. Then he simply turned away and walked through the door. The case's resolution brought different forms of closure to different people. For Linda and Tom Hartley, now able to bury their daughter properly, there was relief mixed with decades of grief. They held a small funeral service in Ridgeline. Jennifer's remains were laid to rest in the town cemetery, under a maple tree she had loved as a child. The headstone read simply, Jennifer Marie Hartley, 1966-1993, forever kind. For the families of Michelle Porter, Teresa Lang, and Kimberly Ross, there was finally certainty after decades of not knowing. Their loved ones came home. They could grieve properly. They could begin to heal. For Detective Rachel Morrison, there was the satisfaction of a promise kept. She had never given up on Jennifer's case. She had fought for funding, for testing, for justice. And in the end, new technology had given voice to evidence that had been silent for 29 years. For the town of Ridgeline, there was a collective shock. The man they had trusted, the man they had admired, the man who had seemed to care so deeply. He had been a monster hiding behind a mask of helpfulness. David Brennan's print shop was sold. The new owners gutted the interior, removing any trace of him. His house on Birch Avenue was demolished. The lot sat empty, no one wanting to build on ground that had held such secrets. The psychological analysis revealed a man who had perfected his hunting method over decades. Small towns, parking lots, victims who worked alone, cars left locked to suggest they had left willingly, and then David would insert himself into the search, enjoying the power of controlling the narrative, while everyone looked for victims he had already killed. His collection of trophies, his detailed notebooks, his organization suggested a man who had been proud of what he'd done, who had seen his victims not as people, but as puzzles he had solved. The act of helping to search for them had been part of his pleasure, the ultimate manipulation, the ultimate control. Jennifer's case had broken open not through traditional detective work, but through the relentless march of technology. DNA that couldn't be analyzed in 1993 became readable in 2022. Genetic genealogy, a tool that didn't exist when Jennifer disappeared, had traced a 30-year-old cigarette butt back to the man who had smoked it. The case highlighted both the limits and the possibilities of criminal investigation. For 29 years, David Brennan had been questioned and cleared. He had passed every interview. He had shown no obvious signs of guilt. He had been exactly where a helpful volunteer should be. But he had also left evidence. A cigarette butt, carelessly discarded. And that single piece of evidence, preserved by a diligent evidence technician who believed that someday technology would catch up, had been enough. In the years since David Brennan's conviction, other investigators have reviewed cold cases in towns where he lived. There are suspicions that Michelle, Teresa, Kimberly, and Jennifer may not have been his only victims. Between 1973 and 1993, David moved through numerous small towns in Oregon, always staying a few years before moving on. In several of those towns, women disappeared under similar circumstances. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit became involved in 2023, creating a comprehensive timeline of David Brennan's movements and cross-referencing them with unsolved disappearances. They identified 7 additional cases that fit his pattern. Women aged 19 to 32, small towns, parking lot disappearances, cars found locked with keys inside, cases that went cold. Some of these cases are too old. Evidence has been lost or destroyed. Police departments from the 1970s didn't always preserve biological evidence, didn't understand that someday technology would make it valuable. But investigators continue to look, hoping that somewhere another cigarette butt might have been preserved. Another piece of evidence might yield DNA. Other families might finally get answers. In 2023, authorities in Montana requested permission to excavate 2 properties where David Brennan had lived briefly in 1974 and 1975. He had worked for a printing company in Missoula for 18 months before returning to Oregon. During that time, 2 women had disappeared from parking lots in towns within 50 miles of Missoula. Their cases had never been solved. Their bodies had never been found. The excavations took weeks. Cadaver dogs alerted to 2 separate locations on the properties, though the land had changed hands multiple times and had been developed significantly since 1975. The remains of 2 women were eventually recovered and identified through DNA comparison with surviving family members. David Brennan was charged with 2 additional counts of murder. He accepted a plea deal, admitting to these crimes in exchange for avoiding the death penalty in Montana's jurisdiction. In his confession, delivered without emotion to investigators, he acknowledged that he had been hunting since his early 20s, that the pattern of moving from town to town, killing, then moving again, had been deliberate, that inserting himself into searches had been, in his words, the most thrilling part. The total confirmed victim count reached 6. Investigators believe the actual number may be higher, possibly as many as 10 or 12 women over a 20-year period. Linda Hartley died in 2023, a year after David's conviction. Her husband Tom followed her 6 months later. They had lived long enough to see justice for their daughter. In their final months, family members said they seemed more at peace than they had been in decades. The not knowing had been its own torture. Knowing, even knowing something terrible, had brought its own strange comfort. Michael Hartley, Jennifer's brother, became an advocate for cold case funding. He testified before the Oregon State Legislature in 2024, successfully lobbying for increased funding for DNA genealogy testing in unsolved cases. The legislation, known as Jennifer's Law, allocated $5 million annually to cold case investigations using genetic genealogy. My sister's case was solved because one evidence technician in 1993 believed that someday technology would catch up, Michael told the legislators. Because one detective in 2019 refused to give up. Because of grant money that paid for testing. How many other families are waiting for the same miracle? How many other victims are waiting for justice? The law passed unanimously. Detective Rachel Morrison retired in 2024 after 33 years in law enforcement. Jennifer's case had been the defining investigation of her career. She had been there at the beginning, a rookie officer searching a dark parking lot. And she had been there at the end, leading the arrest, testifying at trial, standing beside Jennifer's family as justice was finally served. At her retirement party, Rachel spoke briefly about what the case had taught her. Never give up on the victims, she said. Never assume that time has run out. Technology changes. Witnesses remember new details. Evidence that seemed useless becomes valuable. Justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have an expiration date. She kept a photograph on her desk throughout her career. Jennifer Hartley, smiling, holding a puppy at the animal clinic. Rachel looked at that photograph every day for 33 years, making a silent promise that she would find answers. She kept that promise. The legacy of Jennifer Hartley's case extends beyond the conviction of her killer. It has become a case study in how genetic genealogy can solve decades-old crimes. Police departments across the country have used it as an example when requesting funding for cold case DNA testing. The case has been featured in documentaries, true crime podcasts, forensic science conferences, and law enforcement training programs. The techniques used to solve Jennifer's case have been applied to hundreds of other cold cases. The cigarette butt that sat in an evidence box for 29 years became a symbol of hope for families of missing persons everywhere. Evidence preservation protocols were updated nationwide, with departments instructed to preserve any biological material, no matter how small, no matter how unlikely it seemed that it could be tested. But beyond the forensic techniques and the detective work, Jennifer's case is a reminder of how predators can hide in plain sight, how someone can wear a mask of helpfulness and concern while concealing monstrous acts, how trust can be weaponized by those who understand human nature well enough to exploit it. David Brennan knew that in small towns, people trusted their neighbors. He knew that volunteers who stepped up in times of crisis were rarely suspected. He knew that grief made people vulnerable and that a helping hand was rarely questioned. He used all of that knowledge to hunt, to kill, and to hide. He understood human psychology well enough to play the role perfectly. The concerned citizen, the tireless volunteer, the man who cared so much that he couldn't stop searching, even when others had given up. He inserted himself into every investigation because it gave him control, because it allowed him to monitor how close the police were getting, because it fed his need for attention and drama. But he also underestimated several things. He underestimated that evidence technician in 1993 who carefully preserved a cigarette butt, even though the technology didn't exist to test it. He underestimated that rookie officer who would become a detective and never forget the case. He underestimated the progress of science, the power of DNA, and the determination of people who refused to let Jennifer Hartley be forgotten. He underestimated the human capacity for persistence, for caring, for refusing to accept that some questions will never be answered. In the end, David Brennan's careful planning, his decades of successfully evading suspicion, his seeming perfection as a helpful volunteer, all collapsed because of a single cigarette. Because someone had cared enough to preserve evidence. Because someone had cared enough to fight for funding. Because someone had cared enough to never give up. The cigarette butt that sat in an evidence box for 29 years. The DNA that couldn't be read in 1993 but could be read in 2022. The genetic genealogy that traced family trees back through generations. The detective who refused to close the case. The families who never stopped hoping. All of these elements came together after 3 decades to bring David Brennan to justice, to give Jennifer Hartley and the other victims a voice, to prove that even the cleverest predator, even the most carefully constructed mask, can eventually be torn away. The story of Jennifer Hartley is not just about her death, but about her life. The young woman who restored broken furniture because she could see potential in damaged things, who calmed frightened animals with her gentle touch, who volunteered at the wildlife center, caring for injured birds of prey, who called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. Her friends remember her laugh, quiet but genuine. Her co-workers remember her patience. Her family remembers Sunday dinners, her habit of leaving books on doorsteps, her belief that small acts of kindness mattered. In Ridgeline, there is now a memorial bench at the state park where Jennifer volunteered. It sits on a trail overlooking a meadow where eagles hunt. The plaque reads, "In memory of Jennifer Hartley. She cared for those who couldn't speak for themselves." The bench was installed in 2023, funded by donations from the community. The dedication ceremony drew over 200 people, remarkable for a town whose population had dwindled to less than 6,000. Former co-workers from the animal clinic attended, volunteers from the wildlife center where Jennifer had worked, her high school classmates, now in their late 50s, many of whom had moved away but returned for this occasion. Dr. Patricia Reeves spoke at the dedication. She was 71 now, her voice still strong. "Jennifer had a gift," she said. "She could calm the most frightened animal, could ease the most anxious pet owner. She saw the potential in broken things and believed they could be healed. She believed that kindness mattered, that small acts of care could change lives. She was right." Michael Hartley spoke briefly. He thanked the community for never forgetting his sister. He thanked Detective Morrison for never giving up. He thanked the evidence technician from 1993, Marcus Shaw, who had carefully preserved that cigarette butt and who attended the dedication, now retired and in his 70s. "My sister's case was solved by people who cared," Michael said, "by people who believed that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed." Jennifer would have appreciated that. She always believed in the power of persistence, of not giving up on things that seemed broken. Every spring, on March 14th, people leave flowers at the bench. Not many people. Ridgeline's population has dwindled as logging jobs disappeared. But those who remember Jennifer, who worked with her, who knew her, they come. They sit on the bench. They watch the eagles. They remember a kind woman who deserved so much more than 26 years of life. Jennifer's brother Michael brings his grandchildren to the bench sometimes. He tells them about their great-aunt Jennifer, how she taught him to refinish furniture when they were teenagers, how she always had time to help with homework even when she was busy, how she loved animals more than most people she met, how she could take something damaged and broken and make it beautiful again. The grandchildren are too young to understand the full story. They don't need to know yet about David Brennan, about the decades of searching, about the DNA that finally brought justice. They just need to know that there was a woman named Jennifer who was kind and patient and good, who helped things that were hurt, who made beautiful things out of broken pieces. Michael sometimes walks the trail alone, early in the morning when mist hangs in the Douglas firs and the air smells of wet earth and pine. He thinks about his sister, about Friday night dinners at their parents' house, about Jennifer bringing strawberry rhubarb pie that last time, about how none of them knew it would be the last normal moment they'd share as a family. He thinks about the 30 years that passed, the searching, the hoping, the not knowing, the way his parents aged under the weight of Jennifer's absence, the way every holiday felt incomplete, the way every family milestone was shadowed by the fact that Jennifer should have been there. He thinks about David Brennan, sitting in his prison cell, about how Brennan had stood in their living room, had hugged his mother, had searched beside them while knowing exactly where Jennifer was. The betrayal felt almost worse than the murder itself, the calculated cruelty of pretending to care while keeping the family in torment. But Michael also thinks about the people who brought justice. Detective Morrison, spending 3 years fighting for grant money. The genetic genealogist, working through family trees to trace a 30-year-old cigarette butt. The evidence technician who had believed that someday, somehow, technology would catch up. The prosecutor who built an unshakable case. The jury who saw through David Brennan's mask. and he thinks about the future, about the legislation that bears his sister's name, about other cold cases that might be solved because of the funding Jennifer's law provided, about other families who might get answers because Jennifer's case proved that decades-old evidence could speak again. There is no perfect justice. Perfect justice would be Jennifer alive, 59 years old now, maybe married, maybe with children of her own, still working with animals, still refinishing furniture, still calling her mother every Sunday evening. But in an imperfect world, this is the justice that was possible. The killer caught, the victims recovered, the truth told. Other families helped by the precedent Jennifer's case set. Sometimes Michael sits on the memorial bench and watches the eagles hunt. He thinks about how his sister used to care for injured raptors at this very park, how she would spend hours rehabilitating birds, giving them a second chance at flight, how she believed that broken things could heal if someone cared enough to help them. Jennifer cared about broken things. Now, in death, her case has helped heal broken families across the country. Families who were stuck in the torment of not knowing. Families whose cold cases were reopened because of the techniques and funding that Jennifer's investigation helped establish. That's something. It's not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. But it's something. The eagles soar overhead, riding thermal currents above the meadow. The morning sun breaks through the mist. The forest around Ridgeline comes alive with birdsong. And on a bench overlooking this scene, a plaque remembers a young woman who deserved to see many more mornings like this one. That's who Jennifer Hartley was. Not a cold case, not a victim, not a statistic. A person who mattered, who was loved, who was remembered. And in the end, that's what justice really means. Not just punishing the guilty, but remembering the innocent, honoring who they were, ensuring that their story is told not just as a crime, but as a life that had value, a life that should have continued, a life that was stolen, but not erased. Jennifer Hartley existed. She lived fully in her 26 years. She loved and was loved. She created beauty from brokenness. She cared for creatures that couldn't care for themselves. She called her mother every Sunday. She was here. And now, finally, the person who took her away sits in a cell where he will remain until he dies, where he can no longer hurt anyone, where he can no longer play the hero while being the monster, where the mask has been stripped away and he is seen for exactly what he is. That's not perfect justice. Perfect justice would have been Jennifer living to be 82 like her mother, refinishing furniture, caring for animals, calling home every Sunday. But in an imperfect world, it's the justice that was possible, and it came, finally, because people refused to forget, because evidence was preserved, because science advanced, because Detective Rachel Morrison spent 3 years fighting for a $50,000 grant, because sometimes, if you wait long enough and fight hard enough and care deeply enough, the truth comes out. Even after 29 years, even from a cigarette butt, even when the killer was the last person anyone suspected, the truth comes out. And Jennifer Hartley can rest now, her story told, her killer caught, her memory preserved, not as a victim, but as who she really was, a kind woman who saw potential in broken things and tried to fix them. The world was better for having her in it, even for just 26 years. And Ridgeline will remember.